was 41 years old the day my mother-in-law decided that my 7-year-old daughter did not belong in her family, and she made that decision in front of nearly 80 people at a wedding reception on a warm June evening. What happened next started with a hand closing around a little girl's wrist and ended with a hospital report, a police statement, and a truth that an entire family had spent years avoiding. The strange part is that none of it surprised me as much as it should have. By then, I had already spent 8 years watching people decide who I was without ever asking me. In my husband's family, I was known as the woman who was always away somewhere doing government work. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted details. My mother-in-law, Coral, preferred it that way. She liked simple stories because simple stories were easier to control. To her, I wasn't a professional with a career built on responsibility and discipline. I was simply absent. That was the version she repeated often enough that most people accepted it. 2 days before the wedding, I flew home from an assignment. The reception was being held at a lakeside lodge with string lights stretched across the lawn and a wooden dance floor set over the grass. Everywhere I went that afternoon, I kept hearing the same rumor floating through conversations. A colonel was expected to arrive later in the evening. Nobody seemed to know exactly who. They only knew someone important from the military would be there. Coral loved repeating it. She spoke about this mystery guest as if their arrival alone would make the wedding more important. I listened and said nothing. There are moments when correcting people helps, and there are moments when it simply feeds the wrong conversation. My daughter, Laya, cared about none of that. She was 7 years old and completely focused on 2 things she loved more than anything else: animals and dancing. She wore a bright dress and brand new white shoes she had insisted on fastening herself. Every time she spun across the floor, the soles squeaked against the wood and made her laugh. Watching her dance was one of those simple moments that reminds you what joy looks like before the world starts complicating it. The second song of the evening started playing, the same song that always seemed to appear at family gatherings, and she ran toward the dance floor without hesitation. I watched her join a loose circle of children, miss the beat, find it again, and laugh at herself. Then she spotted Coral standing nearby and called out for her grandmother to watch. Coral looked directly at her. She didn't smile. She didn't clap. She didn't acknowledge the excitement in the little girl's voice. She simply stared with an expression so cold, it felt deliberate. I noticed it. I remembered it. But I also knew that not every unpleasant look deserves a confrontation. A little later, Coral found me near the dessert table. She lowered her voice and told me that girls needed mothers who stayed home instead of disappearing whenever the government called. It wasn't the first time she had said something like that. For 8 years, I had heard different versions of the same criticism. According to her, any flaw in my daughter somehow traced back to my career. If Laya was energetic, it was because I wasn't home enough. If she interrupted adults occasionally, it was because she lacked discipline. Every conversation eventually returned to that point. Then Coral shifted to what she really wanted to discuss. She reminded me that important military guests would be arriving and suggested I keep my daughter under control. The implication was clear. My child might embarrass people who mattered. I could have corrected her. I could have told her exactly who the expected colonel was. Instead, I simply nodded and walked away. Respect that must be begged for is not respect worth having. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the atmosphere changed. Certain people started gathering into familiar groups. Coral circulated through the crowd like a politician working a room. Her brother Brett sat near the bar, loudly offering opinions nobody had requested. He liked authority, especially when it belonged to him. Another relative spent most of the reception filming people on her phone and collecting little moments she could turn into gossip later. I noticed all of it. Years of training had taught me to pay attention to patterns. Most problems announce themselves before they arrive. By 6 o'clock, I felt a tension I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear. It was simply the sense that something was moving in the wrong direction. I crouched beside Laya between songs and asked her to stay where I could see her. She promised she would. Children always mean it when they promise things like that. They just forget 5 minutes later. I also spoke with my husband, Sam. I told him I might receive a work call and asked him to keep an eye on our daughter if I stepped away. He agreed. Then he said the same thing he always said whenever his family created a problem. Let it go. It was his favorite solution because it delayed conflict. Unfortunately, delayed conflict is still a conflict. It simply grows while nobody is looking. At 6:40, my phone buzzed. The screen displayed a number I could not ignore. It was work. I stepped a short distance away from the music and answered. The call lasted less than a minute. It was routine. Nothing urgent, but during those few seconds, my attention shifted elsewhere. Then I heard a sound that made every instinct in my body react before my mind understood why. It was a child's cry, not the cry of frustration, not the cry of disappointment, the cry of pain. I turned immediately. Coral was standing on the dance floor. One hand was wrapped tightly around my daughter's wrist. She was dragging her across the wood and toward the grass. One of Laya's white shoes had come off and remained behind. Her arm was bent awkwardly. She was stumbling to keep up, and Coral was speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. She announced that no soldier's child was going to ruin her son's wedding and demanded that somebody remove her. For a moment, the entire reception seemed frozen. Then everything happened at once. People stared, phones appeared, conversations stopped. My daughter clutched her arm and made a small sound that no parent ever forgets. I crossed the distance between us without saying a word. I didn't yell at Coral. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I dropped to my knees in front of my daughter and focused entirely on her. Training teaches you that panic wastes time. Facts matter, observation matters, action matters. I checked her face first. Then I examined the position of her arm without forcing movement. The bruise forming around her wrist already showed the shape of fingers. Coral kept talking behind me, explaining, justifying, rewriting events before they had even finished happening. I ignored her. Silence often encourages people to reveal more than they intended. I lifted my daughter carefully, retrieved the white shoe from the floor, and stood. Then I looked at Sam and told him we were going to the emergency room. My voice was calm. The calmness unsettled people more than anger would have. Someone accused me of overreacting. Someone else insisted children were resilient. None of it mattered. My daughter was injured. The reception could survive without me. We walked to the car. I secured her gently in her seat and prepared to leave. Sam came running after us. He hesitated beside the window and explained that his mother was crying. The wedding was falling apart. People were upset. I listened and then told him a simple truth. Our daughter had been hurt. I was leaving. He could come or stay. Eventually, he chose to stay temporarily because chaos pulls some people the way gravity pulls objects toward the ground. I understood it even though I didn't agree with it. I drove away with my daughter in the back seat and a wedding disappearing in the mirror. Before I reached the highway, messages began arriving. Screenshots, group chat conversations, edited clips. One relative had already uploaded a carefully trimmed video showing only the moment after Coral grabbed Laya. The footage removed context and transformed a frightened child into a misbehaving one. The comments followed immediately. People questioned my parenting. People wondered where I had been. People criticized a situation they had not actually witnessed. I stared at the screen at a red light and felt the temptation to defend myself. Then I remembered something important. A crowd that has chosen a villain rarely changes its mind because of a paragraph. I placed the phone face down and continued driving. The hospital moved quickly once staff saw how my daughter held her arm. A doctor examined her and explained that a forceful pull could dislocate the elbow even in an older child. She asked how the injury happened. I answered honestly. A relative had grabbed my daughter by the wrist and dragged her. The doctor paused briefly while writing. She restored the joint in seconds. There was a soft click, a startled expression on my daughter's face, and then movement returned. Relief washed across her features almost immediately. Children recover with a speed adults often envy. Then the doctor explained what came next. Because an adult had caused the injury, a report would be filed. Certain procedures were mandatory. Child welfare would be notified. Law enforcement would receive documentation. None of it was personal. It was policy. I nodded. Part of me felt strangely comforted. Facts were entering a system designed to record facts. Narratives could still exist, but records existed too. My daughter eventually asked a question that hurt more than anything else that evening. She looked at me with tired eyes and asked whether she was real family. She explained that her grandmother had said otherwise. Before I could answer, a police officer arrived to take a statement. Outside the treatment area, I described everything exactly as it happened. Time, place, actions, witnesses, no exaggeration, no performance. The officer explained possible legal outcomes but made no promises. I told her I wasn't asking for punishment. I only wanted the truth documented. She seemed surprised by that response. Many people want revenge. I wanted accuracy. Later that evening, Sam arrived at the hospital. Seeing the bruise on our daughter's wrist changed something in him. It is easy to dismiss a story. It is much harder to dismiss evidence. He asked if I had called the police. I explained that the hospital had followed protocol. The truth was simple. He worried about what would happen to the family. I reminded him that the family crisis had started long before any report was filed. Then I told him I intended to return to the reception. He looked confused. He asked why. I didn't explain. Some lessons work better when demonstrated than described. I drove home, opened the garment bag hanging in my closet, and removed my dress uniform. Years earlier, I had chosen not to discuss my rank with people who had already decided who I was. Correcting every assumption had seemed exhausting, but that evening felt different. I wasn't putting on the uniform to intimidate anyone. I wasn't seeking applause. I simply refused to remain invisible. Every silver button represented years of work. Every insignia represented responsibility earned through effort. When I finished dressing and looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone transformed. I saw the same woman I had always been. The difference was that other people were finally going to see her too. Before leaving, I sat beside my daughter. She touched one of the insignia and quietly observed that I looked like a soldier. I told her I was one. Then she returned to the question that mattered most. Was she really family? I explained that family isn't determined by bloodlines, opinions, or seating charts. Family is determined by who protects you when protection is required. She listened carefully. Children remember truths that adults often forget. Then I left and drove back toward the wedding. The reception was still alive when I arrived. The music continued. Conversations continued. Coral moved through the crowd, presenting herself as the injured party. I recognized the strategy. Control the story before anyone else can tell it. Yet something had changed. Not everyone looked convinced. Some guests avoided eye contact. Others seemed uneasy. They had seen what happened. They simply hadn't decided whether they were willing to admit it. Then the announcement finally came. The colonel had arrived. Heads turned toward the entrance. People straightened their clothes. Smiles appeared. Expectations filled the air. Most of them expected an older man. Instead, I stepped from the darkness and walked toward the lights. The first person to recognize the insignia was a young service member standing near the entrance. His posture changed instantly. He saluted before he even fully processed who I was. Others followed his gaze. The crowd turned. Conversations stopped. The realization spread across the lawn, one face at a time. I continued walking at an unhurried pace. Silence expanded around me. The same people who had spent years reducing me to a vague description suddenly found themselves confronted with reality. My brother-in-law crossed the floor first. He saluted and addressed me properly. The gesture wasn't about rank, it was about acknowledgement. He had known the truth all along. He had simply never challenged the version his mother preferred. Then I looked toward Coral. The expression on her face shifted from confusion to disbelief. Finally, she whispered the question everyone was thinking. The colonel was me. I confirmed it. Nothing more needed to be said. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Coral recovered and attempted to reclaim control. She smiled. She spoke warmly. She suggested there had been a misunderstanding. She asked about my daughter's condition as though concern had always been her motivation. I answered simply. My daughter had suffered a dislocated elbow. A doctor had treated the injury. The room reacted before she did. People understood what those words meant. Coral insisted children get hurt all the time. She insisted she had only been protecting her. Then she accused me of turning the evening into a spectacle. I replied that I had merely worn the uniform I earned. If people found that dramatic, perhaps they should examine why. Then I removed the folded paper from my pocket and explained that the hospital had documented the injury. The police had documented the incident. Witness statements would be collected. I wasn't interested in arguing. I only wanted to know who had actually seen what happened. The silence lasted several seconds. Then one guest stood and said he had witnessed everything. Another followed. Then another. A bridesmaid described the lost shoe. Others confirmed the force used. One by one, people abandoned the comfort of silence. The story Coral had built all evening began collapsing under the weight of reality. Even the bride eventually spoke. She looked directly at Coral and said she would never forget what she had seen. The room changed at that moment. Not because anyone shouted, not because anyone won an argument. It changed because people finally stopped pretending. As if summoned by the truth itself, the police officer arrived shortly afterward to collect statements. Coral's composure cracked completely. She accused everyone of taking my side because of a uniform. She insisted she had sacrificed everything for the family. She demanded support and found none. Then she turned towards Sam and asked him to stop me. For years, he had spent his life smoothing conflicts and translating bad behavior into something easier to tolerate. This time, he looked at the empty place where his daughter had lost her shoe and chose differently. He told his mother that she had put his child in the hospital. He admitted his own failure to intervene. He accepted responsibility for standing still when he should have acted. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. Then his brother joined him. Together they made it clear that what happened could not be excused. For the first time that evening, Coral stood alone. Eventually, the anger left her. In its place came something older. She described being rejected by her own mother-in-law decades earlier. She admitted that she had spent years trying to ensure nobody ever overlooked her again. Listening to her, I felt sympathy without surrendering judgment. Pain explains behavior. It does not justify it. I told her I was sorry for what had happened in her past. Then I told her that none of it gave her permission to hurt a child. Both statements were true. Understanding and accountability can exist together. Before leaving, I established a boundary. Until trust could be rebuilt, she would not spend unsupervised time with my daughter. It wasn't revenge. It was my responsibility. Nobody argued. The evening finally settled. The officer gathered statements. Guests returned gradually to conversation. Music resumed. I spoke with the bride and groom, apologized for the chaos they never deserved, and encouraged them to reclaim what remained of their celebration. Then I walked back toward my car. My daughter was home. She was safe. That mattered more than every opinion left behind on that lawn. In the weeks that followed, official reviews occurred exactly as they should. Witnesses spoke. Reports were examined. Decisions were made. Consequences followed. Not dramatic consequences, real ones. The kind that becomes part of a record. The family conversations changed too. Some people apologized. Others disappeared quietly. A few finally admitted they had believed the wrong version of events because it had been easier. Sam changed the most. He stopped asking me to let things go. He started recognizing that peace built on silence is not peace at all. Months later, one ordinary morning, music drifted from the kitchen radio. It happened to be that same song, the second song, the one with the familiar rhythm. My daughter climbed down from her chair, stepped into her white shoes, and started dancing. She spun across the floor exactly the way she had at the wedding. Nobody stopped her. Nobody criticized her. Nobody told her she didn't belong. When the music ended, she looked up and asked one final time whether she was real family. This time, there was no uncertainty in her voice, only curiosity. I knelt beside her and explained something many adults spend their entire lives learning. Respect does not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the person willing to protect someone smaller when it would be easier to stay silent. Then, I held out my hand and danced with her. Most people spend years waiting for permission to stand up for themselves, to tell the truth, to stop shrinking so others can remain comfortable. Most people keep hoping difficult situations will solve themselves if they wait long enough. Sometimes they do. Most of the time, they don't. There comes a moment when every person reaches a fork in the road. One path asks for silence because silence is familiar. The other asks for honesty because honesty changes things. One path keeps the peace for a day. The other protects what matters for years. When that moment arrives, the choice is always yours.